Last week, you guys remember that we started talking about comparing and contrasting characters in our novels. We were looking for ways that characters were similar and different. This week, we're going to take a look at setting. Before we actually start comparing and contrasting the settings in our novels, I wanted to take a step back and really look at what setting is and make sure that we as a whole understand what setting is and how we determine the setting of a story, especially when the author does not tell us. So what is setting? Setting is the time and place where a story happens. Knowing the setting helps you visualize the text. Go back to what we've been doing in writing, talking about show, don't tell. When you can visualize what's happening in the story or where things are happening in the story, you're going to get a better idea of what's going on in the story. Knowing the setting also allows you to form expectations. For example, if your story is taking place in the 1700s, well, we know there are no cars during that time period. So as you start to visualize the setting, you know not to expect or not to visualize vehicles. You would rather visualize horses and wagons and things like that. How to determine the setting? The narrator may tell you exactly when and where the story is taking place. But sometimes you have to determine the setting based on clues that the author gives you. If the exact date isn't given by your author, it's okay to say things like, I think this is happening during modern times, or in the recent past, or in the distant past, or even in the distant future. Let's take a look at an example of a story where we must decide when and where the story is taking place, but, most importantly, explain why we think so. Jake hopped on his horse and trotted around the stables. He looked around the range from his mount and considered going on a ride through the prairie. He decided against it. Then he heard a train whistle in the distance. This was it. More settlers had arrived. Now Jake would take some of the weaker horses to the station and sell them to the new folks who were horseless. If I were asked to determine when and where the story is taking place, the first thing I would think about is what I've been told by the author. Obviously, the author does not say this story's setting is, or this story is taking place during, so we have to make some assumptions. We have to make some guesses. Jake is on a horse. He's also around stables, and it mentions being on a prairie. All of these are important clues to me as the reader. When I think of horse and stables and prairie, I usually think of some place like a ranch, someplace with open space. So that's kind of where I envision this story taking place. Maybe a ranch, a lot of open space. I know what a prairie looks like, very flat lands, so that's what I imagine in my head. As far as when this is taking place, again, the author doesn't tell us, but he gives us clues. Talks about a train. 2 different times it mentions this train or this train station. And I don't know about you, but I can't remember the last time I heard a train whistle in my neighborhood. We don't have trains coming through our neighborhood as much as they did a long time ago. So this is one clue that tells me that maybe this setting is taking place in the distant past. Also mentions settlers. The word settler is a word that we don't typically use right now, but I do know from our studies with Colorado history that when people first arrived in a place, they were referred to as settlers. So another clue that this story might be taking place in the past. Also mentions new folks. It's not a word we tend to use very often, the new folks, and it again makes me think of old times, olden days, and how they would have referred to people back then. The fact that trains are mentioned but cars aren't mentioned is another clue to me that this is not a modern day story, but this is happening in the past. So again, when an author doesn't give you specifics, you have to use what they have given you, kind of those clues, to sort of make an inference or a guess. So let's see how I did. This story is taking place in the past, perhaps the late 1800s, on a ranch near a train station. Here's the explanation. I believe this is because the train whistle seems important to Jake. There are no cars, and Jake is selling horses. This last piece is really, really important. Think about what you do every day with your picture of the day. You don't just tell me, I think this is a blank. You have to use my favorite word. You have to give evidence. You have to give your proof why you think this is. Notice as I was going through and talking about why I thought what the time period was, I was explaining as I was going why I thought that. Keep that in mind as you do this. So, as a reminder, the setting is the time and place. Look for clues as to where and when the story is happening if the author clearly isn't stating it. Last, saying things like this is happening during modern times, the recent past, the distant past, is okay if the author doesn't clearly tell you when it's happening.